Bryan Kohberger. Idaho murders. What is he? On Wednesday, Bryan Kohberger was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences for the murders of 4 U.S. university students. It follows a case that has captivated the United States and shocked the small student town of Moscow, Idaho. Kohberger pleaded guilty to murdering Kaylee Gonzalez, Ethan Chapin, Xana Knodel, and Madison Mogan in their off-campus home on the 13th of November 2022. In exchange for the guilty plea, he avoided the death penalty. But no motive on the part of Kohberger is known. He declined to speak during his sentencing hearing, meaning that there's still a degree of mystery around the case. And as a consequence of what has happened, we're going to analyse Kohberger to make a determination as to what he is. Let us start with a recap of the events. The murders occurred at an off-campus rental home at 1122 King Road, Moscow, Idaho, a 3-story house with 6 bedrooms, occupied by 5 female University of Idaho students: Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonzalez, Xana Knodel, and 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. Ethan Chapin, Knodel's boyfriend, was visiting that night. Moscow, a small college town, had not seen a murder since 2015, making the case particularly shocking. Bryan Kohberger, then 28, was a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, approximately 8 miles from Moscow. He had completed his first semester and was a teaching assistant, though he faced complaints about his behaviour towards female students. On the evening of November 12, 2022, Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogan, both 21, were out socialising in downtown Moscow. Surveillance footage captured them walking together, discussing a man named Adam, who was not a suspect, and appearing carefree. Xana Knodel, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20, attended a party at a fraternity house. All 4 victims returned to the King Road residence around 1:45 a.m. on November 13th. Kohberger, living in Pullman, had purchased a KABAR-style fixed blade knife and sheath online approximately 8 months prior, around March 2022, indicating premeditation. His phone records showed he'd visited the King Road area at least 12 to 23 times in the months leading up to the murders, often at night, suggesting stalking behaviour. At 2:47 a.m. on November 13th, Kohberger's cell phone disconnected from the network, consistent with him turning it off to avoid tracking. This marks the start of a roughly 2-hour window during which the murders occurred. Between 3:29 and 4 a.m., surveillance cameras near the King Road house recorded a white Hyundai Elantra, later identified as Kohberger's, circling the neighbourhood multiple times, including an attempt to park or turn around in front of the victim's home. This behaviour suggests reconnaissance or possible hesitation. At 4 a.m., Kohberger parked his white Hyundai Elantra behind the 1122 King Road residence and entered through a sliding glass door in the kitchen on the first floor. He was dressed in black clothing and a mask, as later described by surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen. Between 4:04 a.m. and 4:17 a.m., the murders occurred. Prosecutor Bill Thompson provided a definitive order of the murders during the July 2nd, 2025 plea hearing. Kohberger first ascended to the 3rd floor, where he fatally stabbed Madison Mogan and Kaylee Gonzalez in their shared bedroom. Both victims were stabbed multiple times, with Mogan found on a bed next to a tan leather K-bar knife sheath bearing Kohberger's DNA on the button snap. Kohberger then moved to the 2nd floor, where he stabbed Xana Knodel and Ethan Chapin. Knodel suffered over 50 stab wounds, many defensive, indicating she fought back extensively. Chapin also had defensive wounds, suggesting resistance. The attack was described as profoundly bloody, with a fixed blade knife never recovered as the weapon. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk were on the first floor. At approximately 4:17 a.m., a security camera captured a whimper, a loud thud, and a dog barking, likely coinciding with the attacks. Mortensen, alerted by the noises, opened her bedroom door and saw a masked male figure described as 5'10" or taller, not very muscular, with bushy eyebrows, walking towards the sliding glass door. She locked herself in her room, and Kohberger spared her, possibly owing to exhaustion or time constraints. Mortensen texted Funk expressing panic, and Funk called her parents. At 4:20 a.m., surveillance footage captured Kohberger's Hyundai Elantra leaving the King Road area at high speed, heading towards Pullman, Washington. At 4:48 a.m., Kohberger's phone reconnected to the cellular network on a highway south of Moscow, consistent with his return to Pullman. He later took a congratulatory selfie that morning, suggesting a lack of immediate resource. At 8:30 a.m. on November the 13th, Kohberger returned to the King Road area, possibly to check for evidence or relive the crime, a behaviour which can be seen in some organised killers. At noon, the bodies were discovered after a 911 call from one of the surviving roommates' phones, prompted by an unconscious person report. Autopsies confirmed multiple stab wounds with no evidence of a sexual component to the killings. Kohberger used a fixed-blade K-bar style knife, delivering multiple stab wounds deep in nature to each victim. The attack was intimate and brutal, requiring physical strength and proximity. This suggests that there may have been some form of emotional investment or rage. Zana Knodl's defensive wounds, over 50, indicate a prolonged struggle, while Mogan and Gonzalez were likely attacked in their sleep or shortly after waking. The knife sheath left beside Mogan was a critical error containing a single source of male DNA later matched to Kohberger. Blood evidence was extensive, but Kohberger avoided leaving other identifiable traces, possibly due to his criminology knowledge. The surviving roommate's presence and the dog's barking did not deter him, which indicated focus and control. While no definitive motive was established, Kohberger had photos of one female victim, likely Mogan, on his phone and sent unanswered Instagram messages to her, suggesting some degree of obsession or fixation. Theories have suggested that Mogan and Gonzalez were primary targets, with Knodl and Chapin as collateral victims. Moscow Police Department, led by Chief James Fry, responded to the 911 call around noon on November the 13th. The crime scene was complex, with no immediate suspect or murder weapon. The lack of a murder since 2015 in Moscow heightened community fear. Public tips flooded in. There were over 19,000 of them, driven by intense media coverage and community speculation. The tan leather K-bar knife sheath found next to Mogan's body bore a single source of male DNA on the bottom snap. Investigative genetic genealogy linked to this DNA to Kohberger by comparing it to public databases and later confirming a familial match with DNA from a Q-tip discarded by his father at the family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. On December the 7th, police issued a public alert for a white 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra seen near the crime scene. WSU officers identified Kohberger's white Elantra registered to him, and surveillance footage confirmed its presence circling the King Road area on the night of the murders. Kohberger's phone record showed it was in the King Road area 12 to 23 times before the murders, often at night, and disconnected from 2:47 a.m. to 4:48 a.m. on November the 13th, consistent with the crime timeline. Dylan Morton's description of a masked male with bushy eyebrows matched Kohberger's driver's license photo from a prior traffic stop. Her account of seeing him exit via the sliding glass door corroborated the timeline. No direct social media link was found between Kohberger and the victims, but his now deleted Instagram account followed Mogan, Gonzalez, and Knodl, none followed back. He sent unanswered messages to one victim 2 weeks prior, indicating possible stalking. A Reddit survey he posted in 2022 was asking criminals about their thoughts, emotions, and actions during crimes, mirrored his own actions. A WSU teaching assistant noted Kohberger's increased talkativeness, post-murders, inappropriate conduct towards female students, and injuries, a facial scratch and knuckle wounds, in October to November 2022, which he attributed to a car accident. These raised suspicions but were not conclusive. By mid-December, Kohberger became a person of interest. FBI agents surveilled him at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, observing him wearing surgical gloves and placing trash in a neighbour's bin, possibly to avoid DNA detection. Trash recovered from the Kohberger residence confirmed the familial DNA link. Kohberger and his father drove cross-country from Pullman to Pennsylvania in his white Elantra, starting around December the 15th. They were pulled over twice in Indiana on December the 15th for tailgating, but released with verbal warnings, as officers lacked specific information about the Idaho case. Kohberger changed his car's license plate 5 days after the murders, November the 18th, suggesting an attempt to evade detection. His car was disassembled internally and thoroughly cleaned, indicating efforts to remove evidence. On December the 30th, an FBI SWAT team and Pennsylvania State Police arrested Kohberger at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, approximately 2,500 miles from Moscow. He was found in the kitchen wearing examination gloves and sorting trash into Ziploc bags, consistent with efforts to conceal evidence. A search of the home yielded a knife, a Glock pistol, a black face mask, black gloves, dark clothing, and criminology books, including one on criminal psychology. Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary for entering the home with intent to commit a felony. He was held without bond at the Monroe County Correctional Facility in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Kohberger waived extradition in January during a hearing in Monroe County, Pennsylvania on January the 3rd. He was flown to Pullman, Washington on January the 4th and driven to the Latah County Jail in Moscow, Idaho. On January the 5th, he made his first Idaho court appearance where charges were formally read. 4 counts of first-degree murder for Mogan, Gonzalez, Conodle and Chapin, and 1 count of felony burglary. He was denied bail. A gag order was issued by Magistrate Judge Megan Marshall on January the 3rd, prohibiting attorneys, investigators, and law enforcement from discussing the case publicly, except to quote court documents, to ensure a fair trial. On May the 17th, 2023, a grand jury indicted Kohberger on the same 5 charges, bypassing a preliminary hearing. He stood silent at his May 22nd arraignment, and a not guilty plea was entered on his behalf. On the 26th of June 2023, the Latah County Prosecutor's Office announced intent to seek the death penalty, citing the aggravating circumstances of the murders, premeditation, multiple victims, and brutality. While in Latah County Jail, Kohberger exhibited compulsive behaviours, washing his hands dozens of times daily and taking hour-long showers. He barely slept, staying awake most nights and napping during the day, and spoke with his mother via video call for hours daily. These behaviours suggest anxiety or, alternatively, obsessive tendencies. The defence in January 2024 gained access to sealed investigative genetic genealogy results which linked the knife-sheathed DNA to Kohberger. On September the 9th, 2024, Judge Stephen Hippler granted a defence motion to move the trial to Boise, Idaho, due to pre-trial publicity in Moscow. Kohberger was transferred to Ada County Jail on September the 15th. On November 2024, the defence's motion to remove the death penalty, citing Kohberger's reported autism spectrum disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder, was denied. In June 2025, the defence's attempt to introduce an alternate perpetrator theory was rejected by Judge Hippler as rank speculation, as DNA and fingerprint samples from these individuals showed no connection to the crime scene. The defense was also barred from presenting an official alibi, as no one could verify Kohberger's whereabouts during the murders. On June 30th, 2025, prosecutors announced Kohberger had agreed to plead guilty to all 5 charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The deal, initiated by the defense, required him to waive his right to appeal and accept 4 consecutive life sentences for the murders, plus a maximum of 10 years for the burglary. On the 2nd of July at the Ada County House, Kohberger formally pleaded guilty. Judge Hippler asked if he murdered each victim willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, with premeditation and malice aforethought, to which Kohberger responded yes for each count, showing no emotion. He confirmed he was not coerced or promised anything beyond the plea terms. The Gonzalez family, upset by the deal, requested a full confession and the location of the murder weapon, but prosecutors declined to amend the agreement, citing ethical constraints. Prosecutor Bill Thompson outlined the evidence, including the DNA match, cell phone data showing Kohberger's proximity, and surveillance of his Elantra. No motive was established, and the murder weapon remains missing. Kohberger was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without parole for the murders and 10 years for the burglary to be served at Idaho State Board of Corrections facility. Victim impact statements from the families and surviving roommates were emotional, something I will be addressing in a separate video. Thus, this was an overview of the brutal murders of 4 individuals by Kohberger and the sequence of events that led to his guilty plea and the life sentences that he's been provided with. This then raises the question, what is Bryan Kohberger? Well, he was born on November the 21st, 1994 in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, to Michael and Mary Ann Kohberger. He grew up in a middle-class family in Effort, Pennsylvania, with 2 older sisters. There's limited information available about his early family dynamics, but his parents were reportedly supportive, with his father described as involved, once humorously referring to Bryan's activities as a top-secret mission during his drug use period. It suggested that his family faced challenges owing to his behaviour, with one sister allegedly suspecting his involvement in the Idaho murders before his arrest, indicating possible observable behavioural issues within the family. A court filing references a childhood car accident as a documented traumatic event, though specifics, date, location and injuries are unclear. This incident is cited in defence reports as part of Kohberger's trauma history, alongside past drug abuse, suggesting it may have had a lasting psychological impact. Trauma in childhood can contribute to emotional dysregulation or maladaptive coping mechanisms, though no direct link to his crimes has been established. Former classmates described Kohberger as awkward and bright but socially inept, with significant bullying during his school years at Pleasant Valley High School. He was mocked for his weight and social difficulties, with peers throwing objects at him and girls rejecting him. Sarah Healy, a classmate, noted he was routinely mocked and would run away from confrontations, indicating social withdrawal. This bullying may have fostered feelings of rejection and low self-worth, which he later articulated in online posts. Kohberger reportedly lost 130 pounds in a year through a rigorous boxing and running routine, a transformation that occurred before 2015 when he applied for a school security guard position. This extreme change, to my mind, suggests a significant need for control and a response to body image issues stemming from bullying, which could reflect a desire to redefine his identity or potentially obsessive tendencies. As a teenager, Kohberger posted on the Tapatalk forum under the username XR, discussing visual snow syndrome, VSS, a neurological condition causing visual static. Between 2009 and 2012, he made 118 posts describing severe depression, suicidal thoughts, delusions of grandeur, anxiety, poor social skills, and depersonalization, derealization disorder. He wrote, "I feel like an organic sack of meat with no self-worth, and, as I hug my family, I look into their faces. I see nothing. It is like I am looking at a video game." These posts are most insightful, indicating a profound emotional detachment from the world around him, a sense of unreality, and a lack of emotional empathy. He also admitted being mean to his family, suggesting interpersonal hostility and an absence of emotional empathy. Kohberger's reported social isolation and bullying likely disrupted healthy attachment and social skill development. Attachment theory suggests that early rejection can lead to insecure attachment styles and, of course, could be something that affected his need for control. It's clear that the necessity of control that he clearly had contributed to his later difficulties forming intimate relationships. It may well be the case that as a consequence of the car accident and being on the receiving end of bullying, created a sense of powerlessness, which also resulted in a threat to control. This may have prompted compensatory behaviours like extreme veganism, refusing to use pots that touch meat, or a physical transformation embodying this need for control. His self-reported depression, suicidal ideation suggest a complex mental health profile in adolescence. albeit it might alternatively have been as a consequence of stating these things in order to secure attention from people and linked to wanting control. Kohberger's parents appeared to have been involved, as evidenced by his father driving him cross-country after the murders and answering calls during his drug use period. However, his reported hostility towards family members suggests strained interactions with them. The fact that his sister had a suspicion of his involvement indicates that family members may have noticed concerning behaviours. His family faced significant fallout as a consequence of his actions, with his sisters reported losing professional jobs due to public attention, highlighting the collateral damage of his actions, which demonstrates that he had no concern for the consequences of action, not least, of course, with regard to the people that he murdered, but also with regard to family members affected by the fallout and consequence of his actions. Kohberger's reported emotional detachment from his family, "I see nothing when hugging them," suggests a profound disconnect from them. He clearly had a limited ability to form any form of bond, and this is a significant factor which is often seen in individuals with antisocial or narcissistic traits. The family struggled to address his mental health or substance abuse issues, and therefore there was a lack of intervention, which may have been as a consequence of the legal limitations on forcing treatment on adults. It may also have been the case that he was resistant to the same, once again embodying a need for control. Classmates described Kohberger as socially awkward, with no significant intimate relationships reported. He was allegedly rejected by girls, including a middle school cheerleader, Kim Kennelly, whom he pursued obsessively with love letters and awkward declarations. This again might be demonstrative of the love bombing of the narcissist, or at the very least an individual who would form an obsession and, from that obsession, needed to control the person that was the target. It is evident that he had a disturbing psychological pattern of rage against women who resembled Kennelly, such as the victims Mogan and Gonzalez, which suggest that as a consequence of this rejection by Kennelly, that there was some form of transferred malice. Perhaps because he was unable to assert control over Kennelly, he sought the indirect control over Morgan and Gonzalez by murdering them. It was suggested by a former FBI agent that Kohberger had incel complex, suggesting involuntary celibacy and a desire to assert dominance through violence. While no evidence confirms participation in incel communities, his persistent messaging to one victim on Instagram, which was unanswered, and fixation on Madison Mogan indicate obsessive tendencies. This may well be as a consequence of the desire to repeatedly assert control over this victim through a form of hoovering. It was noted that he had photos of a female victim on his phone, which suggests also stalking behaviour. At Washington State University, where Kohberger was a PhD student, peers reported that he was condescending, which is a haughty and dismissive trait, particularly towards female classmates, and he struggled again to form any meaningful bonds, demonstrating an absence of emotional empathy and an inability to empathise with other individuals. A female colleague, Na Young Ko, reported a possible break-in at her apartment, after which Kohberger helped to install a security system, which hinted at manipulative or intrusive behaviour on his part. Kohberger's history of rejection, particularly by women, will have affected a deep-seated need for control, and may therefore have fostered a resentment in relation to them. It may well be the case that this fits with the psychological profile of the necessity of needing control, whereby the personal failure to control person A leads to the assertion of control over person B, whereby there is a symbolic act of violence against those representing their type, for instance, attractive popular women, so that subconsciously it satisfies a need for control over the original person A. It's clear that Kohberger had an excessive need for control in his interpersonal interactions. This is exhibited by the stalking behaviour, the hoovering, his persistent messaging, his extreme veganism. It has been suggested that this might be compensatory behaviour for perceived social inadequacies, but I view this as much more linked to a need for control. What is also interesting is that there was an absence of documented long-term relationships and reported one-night stand incidents. For instance, he made a comment about good birthing hips, which scared a partner, which show clear difficulties with emotional intimacy. This is reinforced by a self-reported lack of emotion. The fact that he didn't have long-term relationships supports an inability to form such relationships. Furthermore, the fact that he wasn't able to do so tends to go against the usual modus operandi of the narcissist, whereby intimate partner relationships are important and are often present, and whilst they may not last necessarily long, there can be numerous of them. Kohberger pleaded guilty on July 2nd, 2025 to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary for the stabbing deaths of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Zana Knodel and Ethan Chapin in an off-campus home in Moscow. I do not regard that his guilty plea was anything close to an actual admission of guilt, remorse, or an exhibition of conscience. Instead, it was a self-serving act designed to nullify the threat to control posed by the potential death sentence. The act itself, that was premeditated, brutal in its execution, and his behaviour thereafter demonstrated an individual completely devoid of emotional empathy. The fact is that the crime was described as profoundly bloody, with victims showing defensive wounds indicating a struggle. Kohberger did not want to be stopped with regard to murdering those that he did kill. The fact that he walked past a surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, without attacking her, suggests that the need for control had been satiated, and there was also a specificity in his actions. The cell phone records showing Kohberger's phone pinged near the victim's home 12 to 23 times in the months prior, mostly at night, indicates repeated behaviours which would be commensurate with hoovering or stalking, namely the necessity of the assertion of control, but also premeditated behaviours with regard to reconnaissance. Kohberger turned his phone back on at 4:48 a.m. south of Moscow post-crime and took a congratulatory selfie. That morning, this not only suggests a lack of immediate remorse, but a degree of vanity. He returned to the crime scene hours later. This is a behaviour that is seen in some killers, done to check for evidence, which may be linked to the need to assert control, and also to relive the act, which would show some grandiosity. His digital footprint search history included terms like forced, passed out, drugged and sleeping in August 2022, and searches for Ted Bundy before and after the murders suggest a fascination with violent crime and might be linked to character trait acquisition. A 2020 essay for his master's degree detailed a crime scene eerily similar to the Idaho murders, indicating premeditation or fixation. Kohberger studied criminology at DeSales University, earning a bachelor's in psychology in 2020 and a master's in criminal justice in 2022, and was a PhD student at Washington State University at the time of the murders. He took a psychological sleuthing class, analysing killers' minds, and wrote a survey asking criminals about their victim selection and emotions post-crime. His professor, Catherine Ramsland, noticed his intensity and curiosity, but was shocked by his actions. She also wondered if her teachings had inspired him. Stabbing is ordinarily a personal and emotionally invested act which requires proximity and physical engagement, which is to be contrasted with shooting. Given the lack of emotion exhibited on the whole by Kohberger, it would suggest that as opposed to it being an emotionally invested act, it's likely that the murders were driven by a specific grievance, namely, to my mind, a deep-seated threat to his need for control, which was then transferred to the murder of other individuals for the purposes of achieving that control. It's my belief that the targeting of Mogen and Gonzalez were representative of Kohberger's hated type and a subconscious transference of the need for control. His ability to leave a surviving witness unharmed and then return to normal activities, for instance, he then went back to grading papers, indicates a high degree of control, satiation, and compartmentalization. his academic knowledge of crime scene processing suggests he also believed he could commit a perfect crime, which may demonstrate grandiosity and delusion. His searches for Ted Bundy, an interest in serial killers like Dennis Rader, suggest a psychological identification with or idealization of such figures, possibly as a way to maintain control himself, and would perhaps show some degree of character trait acquisition. It was suggested by the defence that Kohberger had autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and developmental coordination disorder, which was as a consequence of rigid thinking, perseveration, impulsive tendencies, and compulsions around hand washing. Certainly his extreme veganism and social difficulties align with these diagnoses. ASD can impair social emotional reciprocity, potentially explaining Kohberger's struggles with relationships and condescending behaviour towards women. OCD could account for his obsessive behaviours and need for control. However, the problem that I see with the diagnosis of ASD and OCD is that these disorders alone do not ordinarily predispose individuals to violence. It's possible that those conditions were in existence, but I don't see that they were the overriding conditions that caused him to behave as he did. It's also the case that I am of the view that the defence used these diagnoses to argue against the death penalty, and therefore they were used strategically. I understand that there was no prior diagnosis before this criminal case against Kohberger. Ordinarily, a diagnosis would have been more likely to have been achieved prior, and therefore it strikes me that this was potentially a manipulation on the part of Kohberger in an attempt to escape liability, or at least the death sentence, by claiming to have such diagnoses. What is clear that Kohberger had a complete lack of remorse. During his plea hearing, he was noted as flippant and defiant. He had a history of bullying others. He had the ability to resume normal activities post-murder, which, that cold detachment, accords with psychopathy. Whilst it's the case that there is no actual diagnosis of psychopathy, I'm going to utilise the term because of its familiarity for people. His online posts about feeling no emotion and little remorse as a teen, combined with his fascination with serial killers, certainly aligns with psychopathic traits like callousness and grandiosity. The cold detachment certainly sits with the calculated nature of the murders, his lack of emotional empathy for the victims and others affected by his behaviours. Furthermore, the cold detachment, evidenced through his ability to evade immediate detection, also supports those psychopathic traits. It's clear that Kohberger has an entrenched and pathological need for control, which presents in both narcissism and psychopathy. To my mind, the symbolic targeting of the victims as representatives of rejection aligns with his grandiose need to assert dominance and his pathological need for control. It is my view that the rejections that he had experienced threatened his need for control, and therefore there was a transference to an indirect assertion of control by murdering the victims who were viewed as similar to the primary focus of his rejection. It's evident that he sought stimulation from what he'd done. The looking up of information beforehand, part of the need for control in the planning, but also shows stimulation. Stimulation may also have been achieved by revisiting the scene and replaying in his mind what had actually happened. Accumulation is demonstrated by the number of victims that were involved. He exhibits callousness, a cold detachment, a complete lack of emotional empathy, and therefore it's quite clear that a case is made out for psychopathy in relation to Kohberger. What about the possibility of a comorbid condition with regard to narcissistic personality disorder? Well, it was reported that Kohberger had a need to prove his intelligence in class, which would be linked to a need for control and potentially the receipt of fuel by way of people's reactions to his perceived intelligence, and supports grandiosity. His condescending attitude and possible delusions of grandeur suggest narcissistic traits. His fixation on victims and a desire to commit a perfect crime indicates need for validation and also control. It's likely, as well, that there was a crossover with regard to control in respect of narcissism because the murders were a response to perceived slights, and therefore he experienced narcissistic wounding, with the victims symbolising those that had rejected him. The selfie and the return to the crime could also be seen as a need for recognition. It could also be seen as the thrill-seeking that can be associated with some aspects of psychopathy. What goes against a full finding of narcissistic personality disorder is the fact that Kohberger's social isolation contrasts with the narcissist's need for some form of fuel matrix. It is likely, of course, that even a narcissist who might not be as sociable or as socially engaged as him could exist, but the loner activity that he engaged in tends, to my mind, militate against a finding of narcissistic personality disorder. There doesn't appear to have been a repeated and sustained necessity for the receipt of fuel either. There appears to be some character trait acquisition that has taken place. It's certainly the case that with regard to the behaviours that have been witnessed, he had a grandiose sense of self-importance, for example, believing that he could commit the perfect crime. And with the need to prove his intelligence, that could be something as he expects to be recognised as superior. But it doesn't appear to be pervasive in many of his behaviours, and there's no evidence, for instance, of the exaggeration of achievements or talents. There may have been some preoccupation in relation to the involvement with women, but there doesn't appear to be evidence that supports a preoccupation with regard to unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty. The love bombing was cack-handed and awkward, and while some narcissists might engage in such behaviour, it would appear that this was not a routine way that he tried to deal with people within intimate relationships. Indeed, it would appear that he was more likely to not become involved in them rather than do so. It doesn't appear to be the case that he was in need of excessive attention by way of the provision of fuel. Similarly, whilst there are aspects of entitlement in his behaviour, I do not see, having scrutinised the evidence with regard to his conduct and behaviour in his life, that there was repeated instances of unreasonable expectations of especially favourable treatment. There have been difficulties with his interpersonal relationships, some of which might have been regarded as interpersonally exploitative, but this was not a recurrent theme. He clearly demonstrates an absence of emotional empathy. It's not the case that he necessarily demonstrates huge amounts of envy either. And as a whole, I see that there are narcissistic traits in relation to Kohberger, but I don't see a case being made out for full narcissistic personality disorder. There's some sense of entitlement. There's a clear lack of emotional empathy. There's a degree of lack of accountability, although interestingly, he does show some degree of accountability with regard to his behaviours, the way he would self-describe certain behaviours and the way that he would report them. There's some grandiosity. There's some degree of haughty behaviours. There's evidence of some manipulation. There's evidence of some lack of boundary recognition. I don't particularly see much in the way of the narcissistic dynamic. And therefore, overall, I would see that he certainly has narcissistic traits, and they are reasonably strong, but not sufficient to place him within the category of being a narcissist. Kohberger's teenage post described severe depersonalization derealization disorder, feeling like he was in a video game with no emotions. I regard this as something which is more linked to his emotional detachment as a consequence of his psychopathy and absence of emotional empathy as opposed to depersonalization derealization disorder. His calm demeanour post-murder is also demonstrative of that cold, detached nature driven by his absence of emotional empathy. It's also the case depersonalization, derealization disorder is not inherently linked to violence, and certainly not on the scale that was exhibited by Kohberger. There has been some speculation that Kohberger's heroin use in 2013-2014, combined with autism spectrum disorder, may have induced drug-related schizophrenia. Substance abuse can, of course, exacerbate underlying mental health issues, potentially contributing to delusional or disorganized thinking. Nevertheless, there's no evidence confirming ongoing drug use at the time of the murders, and schizophrenia is generally unlikely given his academic success and far more organised behaviour. The suggestion that he was engaged in a substance-induced psychotic or schizophrenic episode is purely speculative and lacks clinical support. Overall, it appears to my mind that there is a complex interplay of developmental, personality and situational factors. To my mind, the most appropriate diagnosis, based upon the evidence behaviours, the reported behaviours, and his conduct, is of an individual who has antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, with narcissistic features. This is supported by the lack of remorse, calculated behaviour, a history of interpersonal hostility, fascination with serial killers, indicating his antisocial tendencies. His ability to resume normal activities post-murder and evade immediate detection suggest impulsivity control typical of ASPD and a lack of emotional empathy. His need to prove intelligence, fixation on victims as symbols of rejection, and possible delusions of grandeur point more to narcissistic traits, where violence had been used as a means to assert dominance, both in terms of the need for control and of the prime aims, and also in relation to the necessary triad. The obsessive behaviours, the compulsive tendencies, may not support a full OCD diagnosis, and to my mind are more redolent of, again, the necessity of control. Bullying, the car accident and social rejection fostered a sense of alienation and resentment, all linked to the need of his control. His criminology studies, particularly his engagement with serial killer psychology, may well have been harnessed by way of character trait acquisition as part of his narcissistic traits, and also the necessity of control to provide a framework for planning the perfect crime, blurring the line between academic interest and personal fixation. Bryan Kohberger's profile is marked by a troubled childhood involving bullying, a traumatic car accident and early substance abuse. His familial relationships were strained by his emotional detachment and hostility. His lack of intimate relationships and a history of rejection fueled resentment, particularly towards women. His crimes, calculated, brutal and targeted, reflect a complete absence of emotional empathy, a combination of antisocial traits, some narcissistic traits, amplified by his criminology studies and fascination with serial killers. Ultimately, I form the view, with regard to the question of what is Bryan Kohberger, that he is a psychopath with narcissistic traits. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.